A man can lose a house and still walk out standing. What breaks him is watching his own brother read the will out loud and not once look up. This is the story of Feliciano Ramos and of the dog that carried, tied under his collar, the one page that could have changed everything from the very first day. The rain had started that morning and hadn't stopped by the time the lawyer arrived, and the whole valley below El Retiro sat wrapped in the kind of low gray cloud that made the pines look almost black against the mountainside. Inside the main house, the family and the few farmhands who'd been asked to witness the reading crowded into a room that still smelled faintly of the candles lit for Rutilio Ramos's wake barely a week before. Feliciano stood at the back of the room while the lawyer read the last testament of Rutilio Ramos in a voice flat enough to sell cattle. And when the final line landed, to the elder son, Anastasio, the whole of the property known as El Retiro, in the Sierra de Chiapas, nobody said the second half of the sentence out loud, because there wasn't one. Nothing had been left for Feliciano, not the cabin, not the mule pen, not even the small chapel his own mother had helped whitewash with her hands. Anastasio didn't smile, but he didn't need to. He simply folded his copy of the will and slid it into his coat, the way a man puts away a receipt for something he already expected to buy. The lawyer, a thin man from Ocosingo who'd made the ride up especially for the reading, cleared his throat and began gathering his papers as if eager to be gone before anyone in that room found the nerve to ask the questions no one had asked yet. Why the old will, drawn up years earlier and witnessed by half the village, had suddenly been replaced 2 weeks before Rutilio Ramos died, by a version no one but Anastasio seemed to have known existed. He signed it himself, of sound mind, the week before he passed, the lawyer said, as if reciting a line he'd rehearsed on the ride up. Properly witnessed. Nothing irregular about it. Nobody in that room quite believed him, but nobody said so either, because in that part of the Sierra a lawyer's word still carried the weight of the law itself, whether or not it deserved to. You always did all the work, and none of the asking, said old Herminia, the cook, under her breath, not quite loud enough for Anastasio to hear, though loud enough that Feliciano did. He said nothing back. He walked out to the yard, where a lean, brindle-coated dog was waiting by the gate, the same dog that had followed his mother everywhere in her last years, and had slept outside Feliciano's door every night since she died. Its name was Trueno, and it had one torn ear from a fight with a fox 2 winters back. Get away from that animal, Anastasio called from the porch, his voice already practicing the tone of a landowner. The dog belongs to the property, same as the mules. Feliciano crouched, scratched behind the good ear, and looked up at his brother with a stillness that unsettled Anastasio more than any shouting could have. Keep him then, Feliciano said. But you should know something, Anastasio. A dog only ever obeys the hand that actually feeds him. And you never once fed this one. That should have been the end of it. Feliciano packed a single bag, took his father's old machete and a photograph of his mother standing outside the cabin door, and walked down the mountain road with nothing else. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that Trueno had trotted after him before he'd gone a mile, and that fastened to the underside of the dog's worn leather collar, hidden by a flap Feliciano's own mother had sewn there years before she died, was a single folded page that was going to undo everything the lawyer had just read aloud. The road down from the Sierra took 2 full days, through cloud forest and cold fog that clung to the pine trees until mid-morning, and Feliciano arrived in the valley town of Yajalm with his boots ruined and a grief in his chest so heavy it made his shoulders curve forward as he walked. He had an old friend of his father's there, a widower named Fidencio Coyoc, a beekeeper who had known Rutilio Ramos since they were boys herding goats together, and who had once told Feliciano, half in jest, that he'd always have a chair at his table if life ever turned hard. So it turned hard, Fidencio said simply, standing in his doorway when Feliciano appeared with the dog at his heels and nothing else to his name. He didn't ask what happened. He just stepped aside to let him in. First God, then supper. Whatever else you need to say can wait until you've eaten. Fidencio's house sat at the edge of Yajalm, close enough to hear the church bell but far enough from the market that the smell of pine and wood smoke reached the door before any noise from town did. It was a modest place, one main room, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a small chapel side shrine to the Virgin that Fidencio's late wife had kept lit with a single candle for 30 years, a habit he'd never had the heart to break even after she was gone. Feliciano set his bag down by the door, and Trueno, exhausted from 2 days of mountain road, collapsed onto the packed dirt floor with a groan that made both men almost smile despite everything. The first weeks in Yajalm moved slowly, the way grief moves when a man has nowhere left to direct his anger. Feliciano rose before dawn from habit. Though there was no cabin to tend, no goats of his own to herd, and instead he began helping Fidencio with the hives, learning to read the bees the way he'd once read weather on the mountain, by the pitch of their hum, by how they clustered near the hive door on cold mornings. Trueno stayed close, sniffing at every crate and every jar of honey, as though searching for the one thing that still smelled like home. Your father used to say, a man who works with bees learns patience faster than any priest could teach it, Fidencio told him one morning, handing him a smoker. Bees don't forgive a man who rushes. I'm not in a hurry to be anywhere, Feliciano answered. And something in his own voice surprised him. The first flicker of dry humor he'd managed since the funeral. Sundays, the two of them walked down together to the small church at the center of Yajalm, and though Feliciano said little during Mass, he found something steadying in the routine of it. The same hymns, the same worn pews, the same old priest, Father Casimiro, who had buried half the valley's parents and baptized half its children, and seemed to carry both facts with the same quiet grace. Trueno waited outside on the church steps every week without being told to, and was usually asleep in the sun by the time the doors opened again. Your mother used to light a candle here every time she came down from the mountain, Father Casimiro told Feliciano one Sunday, without being asked. She always lit it for you, not for herself. Whatever you're carrying up there, son, she was carrying it longer and asking God to carry it too. Feliciano didn't answer, but he lit a candle of his own before he left that morning and didn't tell Fidencio why his eyes were red on the walk home. Word of what had happened up at El Retiro traveled slowly, the way news always does down a mountain, carried by traders and by the priest who circuited the villages twice a month. It came back changed. As rumors do, some said Anastasio had already sold 24 head of cattle to a buyer from Tuxtla. Others said he'd stopped paying the 2 farmhands who'd worked the land for 20 years, and that both had quit within the month rather than keep serving a man who wouldn't look them in the eye. That family never did know how to hold on to loyalty, said a woman selling woven cloth in the market, not knowing Feliciano was close enough to hear. The father did. The son doesn't. Feliciano heard it and said nothing, though something in him, not forgiveness, not yet, but something quieter than the rage he'd carried down the mountain, began to settle differently in his chest. Fidencio noticed it too, and one evening, without being asked, brought out 2 cups of the dark chocolate drink his late wife used to make on cold nights, because a man rebuilding himself needs something warm in his hands, not just work. Other bits of news trickled down too, carried by whoever happened to be traveling that week, that Anastasio had stopped going to Mass since the funeral, that the chapel his mother had whitewashed stood locked now, its candle unlit for the first time in decades, and that even Herminia, the old cook who'd stayed on at El Retiro out of habit more than loyalty, had begun quietly asking around the valley whether anyone in Yajal needed kitchen help. A house that stops praying together stops being a house, Father Casimiro said once, when the subject came up after Mass. It just becomes a building with a family's name still nailed to the door. Fidencio nodded slowly at that, and Feliciano said nothing. But he found himself thinking of it again that same night, lying awake and listening to Trueno's steady breathing on the floor beside him. One rain-soaked evening, 6 weeks after Feliciano arrived, Trueno began scratching at his own collar with such persistence that Feliciano finally sat the dog down between his knees to see what was wrong, worried a burr had worked its way underneath the leather. It was then, running his thumb along the seam his mother had once stitched, that he felt the stiffness of paper where there should have been none. "Hold still," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog, working his fingers gently along the worn leather while Trueno sat unusually patient, as if he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that this was the moment he'd been waiting to be still for. He cut the thread carefully with his father's old machete blade, and a single folded sheet slid out, brittle with age, sealed at some point with a dab of candle wax that had long since cracked. Feliciano's hands went still before they went shaking. "Read it before you decide it's nothing," Fidencio said quietly, watching from his chair, setting down the jar of honey he'd been labeling. The letter was in his mother's handwriting, dated nearly 10 years earlier, addressed to no one in particular, a private letter she had apparently never sent, describing a promise Rutilio had made to her on his knees the year Feliciano turned 20. That whatever else happened between the brothers, the cabin and the small parcel around the chapel she'd helped whitewash would belong to their younger son, because Anastasio will always have the land's yield, but Feliciano is the one who will keep faith with the ground itself. Folded inside the same page was a second document, a short, separately notarized declaration bearing Rutilio's signature and a stamp from a notary in Ocosingo, dated years before his death, assigning that same parcel to Feliciano by name. "This was never revoked," Fidencio said, turning the paper toward the lamp to read the date twice. "Whatever your brother read out loud in that room was written after this one, and written a lot more conveniently, if you ask me." Feliciano sat with the letter a long while, saying nothing, the rain ticking steadily against the tin roof, while Trueno rested his head against his knee, as if he understood, in his own way, that he had just delivered the one thing his mistress had trusted him to carry longer than she herself had lived. Feliciano read the letter a second time, and then a third, tracing his mother's handwriting with one finger, as though the shape of the letters themselves might tell him something the words hadn't already said. "She never told me any of this," he said finally, his voice barely above the sound of the rain. "Not once. Not even at the end, when she must have known she was running out of time to say it. Some people don't tell you the truth outright," Fidencio said. "They just make sure it survives them, one way or another, and trust that the right hands will eventually find it. Looks like she trusted this one." He nodded toward Trueno, who thumped his tail once against the floor, as if he'd understood that too. Word was sent to a notary in Ocosingo, who still had his old ledgers, and within the week the man confirmed what the paper already showed, that the declaration was genuine, properly filed, and never once challenged or withdrawn in all the years since. It was also within that week that Anastasio arrived in Yajal himself, having heard, as everyone eventually hears everything in that valley, that his brother was in possession of a document that could cost him a piece of land he'd already begun to sell around. "You need to hand that paper over," Anastasio said. Standing in Fidencio's doorway with the rain still dripping from his hat, his voice pitched somewhere between command and plea. "Whatever it says, it isn't yours to use. It has my name on it," Feliciano said, not moving from his chair. "Written by our father, in his own hand, years before he was ever sick enough for anyone to rush him into signing something else. Our father wanted the land to stay whole," Anastasio said. "He told me so himself. He told you what he needed you to hear so you'd behave while he was alive," Fidencio cut in, standing now, his one good hand resting on the back of Feliciano's chair. "I knew Rutilio longer than either of you have been alive. He never once said a word to me about keeping the land whole. He said plenty about making sure his younger boy wouldn't be left with nothing the day he was gone. And the notary who wrote up that second will," Feliciano added, "wasn't the same one who handled every other paper our father ever signed in his life. Ask yourself why that is, Anastasio, and ask it honestly, just once." Anastasio's jaw worked, but nothing useful came out of it. Outside, two neighbors who'd followed him up the street out of simple curiosity lingered near the gate, no longer pretending they weren't listening, and Father Casimiro himself, passing on his way back from visiting the sick, slowed his steps enough to hear. "I didn't come down that mountain to take your inheritance from you, Anastasio," Feliciano said, and his voice, when it finally rose only enough to be heard clearly, never to shout. "I came because you left me nothing and let me believe I deserved it. I'm not asking for El Retro. I'm only telling you that what was mine stayed mine, whether you wrote me out of the story or not. You always did think you were better than me," Anastasio said, and the words cracked slightly on their way out, the old childhood wound still raw under all the years. "I never thought that," Feliciano answered. "I only ever thought our father loved us both the same, and that you were the one who couldn't rest until you'd proven he didn't." Anastasio stood a moment longer, and whatever he might have said next dissolved somewhere on its way to his mouth. Father Casimiro, still standing near the gate, said nothing either, but the look on his face was enough that even Anastasio seemed to feel its weight before he turned away. He turned without another word and walked back into the rain. And this time, no one. Not the neighbors at the gate, not Fidencio, not even Trueno lying calm by the hearth, bothered to watch him all the way down the street. When the sound of his brother's horse faded past the church, Feliciano let his shoulders drop for what felt like the first time in 2 months, and breathed out slowly, as though some old weight had finally agreed to let go of his chest. Months later, when the rains eased and the cloud forest above Yajalm turned bright green again, Feliciano returned to the Sierra with a notarized declaration in hand and a judge's ruling that no one in Ocosingo saw fit to question. He didn't take back El Retro whole. He didn't want it. He claimed only the small parcel around the whitewashed chapel and the cabin where his mother had lived out her last years. And that was enough. With Fidencio's help, and with the 2 farmhands who'd quit Anastasio's service and asked, almost shyly, whether Feliciano might have work for them instead, he rebuilt the cabin's roof before the first cold nights of the season and set new hives along the tree line, because a man who has learned to read bees doesn't easily stop. The smell of wood smoke and warming honey drifted from the chimney every evening, and Trueno slept, as he always had, right at the threshold of the door, one paw twitching now and then as though still standing guard over a secret he no longer needed to keep. The whitewashed chapel his mother had cared for was reopened that first month back, its single candle relit by Father Casimiro himself, who made the climb up from Yajalm especially for it, and stayed to bless the cabin's new roof beam while he was there. Neighbors who hadn't set foot on that stretch of the mountain in years came up too, bringing baskets of dried chiles, Jars of honey, they insisted, weren't as good as Feliciano's own, and one old woman who claimed she'd known his mother as a girl and wanted, finally, to say so out loud. One Sunday, with the tables set outside under the pines and a pot of hot chocolate passed hand to hand among neighbors who had walked up from the valley just to see the cabin standing whole again, Fidencio finally said aloud, in front of everyone, what he'd carried quietly for years, that he intended to spend whatever time he had left close to this family, because a man alone too long forgets what a table is even for. Father Casimiro, seated at the far end with a cup of chocolate warming his good hand, added his blessing over the meal before anyone had a chance to eat, the way he always did, and no one minded the wait. The two farmhands, Cirillo and Domingo, had brought their own families up the mountain by then, and their children chased each other around the chapel steps, while Trueno lay in the grass watching them with the patient, half-closed eyes of a dog who had done his job and no longer needed to worry over anything. Someone had brought a guitar, and by the time the sun dropped low over the ridge, 3 generations of Yajalm were singing old songs that Feliciano's mother would have known every word to. Does it still hurt? Everything he took? Fidencio asked Feliciano later that evening, the two of them sitting outside as the light went gold over the ridgeline, the singing fading slowly behind them as neighbors began the walk back down to the valley. Not anymore, Feliciano said, watching Trueno stretch out in the last of the sun. He didn't take as much as he thought he did. He only ever had the land. He never had what actually kept me standing. If God wanted the land to go to Anastasio, then let it be his to answer for. I only ever needed enough ground to stand on, and I have that now. Trueno lifted his head at the sound of his name in the quiet, or maybe just at the shift in Feliciano's voice, and looked at him with the calm, unhurried patience of an animal that has never once needed applause for doing what loyalty required. You were the only one who never once let me down, Feliciano told him, resting a hand on the dog's head, and Trueno only closed his eyes, as if he'd have carried that letter another 10 years if that's what it had taken. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who leave us with nothing, and it takes someone far quieter. An old friend, a stitched collar, a dog who never once asked for thanks, to hand us back what should have been ours from the beginning. Blood is not always the safest place to keep a promise. Sometimes it has to be sewn into leather and carried down a mountain by 4 legs instead of 2, so that it survives long enough for the truth to finally be read. Has loyalty ever shown up for you in a shape you never expected? Something small, something overlooked, and carried you further than the people who were supposed to. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Share it with someone who once felt like they'd been left with nothing. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Until the next one. Fidencio would tell it for years afterward, to anyone who asked how the Ramos boy got his mother's land back, that the real inheritance was never in the will at all. It had been stitched under a dog's collar the whole time, waiting for someone patient enough to notice.